His hands trembled as he stared at the cafeteria line. September 1943, Camp Lordsburg, New Mexico. Georg Gärtner, prisoner of war number 31A44164, couldn't process what he was seeing. White bread, stacks of it, butter, real butter, in portions larger than his family had seen in 2 years. And then the guard placed it on his tray: meat, vegetables, a slice of apple pie. In Tunisia, his regiment had eaten sawdust bread and horse meat for 6 months. Here, in enemy captivity, he was being served better food than officers ate in Berlin. His throat tightened. Every propaganda film he'd watched, every speech about American weakness, every promise that Germany would crush this decadent nation, all of it was colliding with the weight of a metal tray in his hands. The man behind him in line whispered in German, "Mein Gott, they feed their prisoners like this?" Gärtner didn't answer. He couldn't. Because this tray of food wasn't just a meal, it was the first crack in everything he'd been told to believe. And over the next 2 years, those cracks would widen into a chasm so vast that this 23-year-old sergeant would make an impossible choice: spend 40 years as a fugitive in America rather than return to the fatherland. This is the story of the man who saw too much, who learned too much, who chose captivity over freedom because freedom, as it turned out, meant returning to a lie. May 12, 1943, Tunisia. The sand tasted like copper and gasoline. Georg Gärtner lay face down in the North African dirt. British rifles pointed at his spine and waited for the bullet that would end the war for him. His sergeant's uniform was stiff with dried blood, not his own. His regiment, the 190th Panzer Grenadier, had ceased to exist 3 hours ago. Around him, 238,000 German and Italian soldiers were surrendering, the largest Axis capitulation since Stalingrad. He was 23 years old. He had never been more certain he was about to die. But the British soldier who grabbed his collar didn't execute him, didn't even hit him, just searched him for weapons, gestured toward a collection point, and offered him water from a canteen. The water was clean, cold. It was Gärtner's first lesson, though he didn't recognize it yet. The enemy wasn't what he'd been promised. 3 weeks later, aboard a Liberty ship crossing the Atlantic, Gärtner and 2,000 other POWs received their first American Red Cross parcels: chocolate, cigarettes, condensed milk, a razor and soap, a letter-writing kit. One prisoner, a veteran of the Eastern Front, started crying, quietly, ashamed, turning his face to the bulkhead. "We killed Russian prisoners," he whispered to no one in particular. "We starved them. They're going to do the same to us." But they didn't. The ship docked in Norfolk, Virginia on June 3, 1943. The prisoners were loaded onto trains, regular passenger trains, not cattle cars, and given box lunches for the journey west. Ham sandwiches, fruit, a cookie wrapped in wax paper. Gärtner sat by the window and watched America scroll past. Farmhouses with electrical lights, cars on every road, grain silos that looked like cathedrals, towns that hadn't been bombed, children playing in yards without fear of air raids, women in colorful dresses shopping on main streets where stores had full windows. He'd been told America was collapsing, weakened by racial mixing and Jewish influence, starving because they'd sent all their food to Britain. His eyes showed him something different. Every hour the train rolled west. Another propaganda lecture died in his memory. June 6, 1943, Camp Lordsburg, New Mexico. The camp sat in high desert country where the temperature reached 115 degrees by afternoon and dropped 40 degrees after sunset. Barbed wire, guard towers, wooden barracks arranged in precise rows. It looked exactly like what Gärtner expected a prison camp to look like, until the first meal. The mess hall could seat 400 prisoners at once. The walls were painted white. The tables were clean. And when the line started moving, Gärtner's brain struggled to process what was happening. The American cooks, black soldiers, most of them, which itself contradicted every Untermensch lecture he'd absorbed, were serving portions that belonged in a fever dream. Pork chops, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread with butter, coffee with sugar, and for dessert a slice of pie with a consistency he'd forgotten existed. Werner Krauss, a corporal from Hamburg, stopped moving. The line backed up behind him. He was staring at his tray like it might be a mirage. "What's wrong?" an American guard asked. Not hostile, curious. Krauss couldn't answer in English. Gärtner tried, his English broken and halting. Surprised. Much food." The guard looked confused. "This is standard rations, Geneva Convention requirements." Standard. That word did something to Gärtner's understanding of the war. If this was standard for prisoners, what did actual American soldiers eat? What did civilians eat? How could a nation at war, fighting on two fronts, have so much that it could feed its enemies better than Germany fed its own troops? He sat at a long table and ate mechanically. The pork chop was tender. Real meat, not the gristle and mystery protein they'd been getting in Africa. The potatoes were made with milk and butter. There was enough bread that men were leaving pieces uneaten. Across from him, a sergeant named Otto Becker was crying into his hands. "My daughter," he said. "She's 12. She hasn't seen butter in a year. And we're eating this." No one responded. What could they say? That night in the barracks, the argument started. Some men insisted it was a trick. Americans were fattening them up before the real cruelty began. Others said the food proved America was weak. Only a soft nation would waste resources on prisoners. A few, like Gärtner, said nothing and lay awake on surprisingly comfortable bunks, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile propaganda with reality. The cognitive dissonance was physical. It made his chest tight. August 1943, the work assignments began. To address critical labor shortages, the U.S. government contracted POWs to local farms and ranches, paying their wages to the camp administration. The prisoners would spend 6 days a week outside the wire, supervised but relatively free, experiencing American life directly. Gärtner was assigned to the Hendricks Ranch, 40 miles from camp. Thomas Hendricks was 53, weathered by sun and wind, a third-generation rancher who'd lost his 2 sons to the war, one in Italy, one in the Pacific. He had every reason to hate Germans. When the truck dropped off 6 POWs at his property that first morning, Gärtner expected hostility. Instead, Hendricks nodded, said, "Y'all speak English?" And when they gestured uncertainly, he pointed at the cattle pens and mimed mucking out stalls. The work was hard, physical, honest. At noon, Hendricks's wife brought lunch, sandwiches thick with roast beef, lemonade in a glass pitcher. She set the food on a table in the shade and walked away without a word. Werner Krauss picked up a sandwich, looked at it, looked at Gärtner. "She feeds us like family." "We're not family," Gärtner said. "We're prisoners." "Then why does her food taste like love?" It was an absurd thing to say. But Gärtner understood what Krauss meant. There was something in the gesture, the cold lemonade, the generous portions, the fact that she'd put the food on real plates instead of military mess kits, that communicated something beyond duty. It was care. Voluntary, unnecessary care. Over the following weeks, Gärtner learned the rhythm of American ranch life. He learned that Hendricks owned 3 trucks and 2 tractors, machinery that German farmers could only dream about. He learned that the Hendricks house had electric refrigeration, indoor plumbing, a radio in the living room, and a telephone on the wall. He learned that the neighboring rancher who stopped by to help fix a fence owned an airplane for surveying his cattle. An airplane. For cattle. One evening, as the sun set orange and purple over the desert mountains, Hendricks sat on the fence beside Gärtner and offered him a cigarette. Real tobacco, not the ersatz garbage German soldiers had been smoking. "You fight in Africa?" Hendricks asked. "Yes, sir." "My boy Michael was there, Tunisia. He wrote that you boys fought hard." Gärtner didn't know what to say. "I am sorry about your sons." Hendricks was quiet for a long time. "War's a hell of a thing. I don't blame you personally. You didn't start it. But I fought for it. Did you? Or did you fight because not fighting meant getting shot?" The question landed like a physical blow, because Hendricks was right. Gärtner had joined the Wehrmacht at 18 because refusing wasn't an option. He'd been raised on Hitler Youth songs and strength through joy rallies and promises of German greatness, but the actual decision to put on the uniform had been made by a system that didn't ask his opinion. "You seem like decent men," Hendricks continued. "Work hard. Don't cause trouble. I figure you're just young and got dealt a bad hand." It was the first time an American had addressed Gärtner as a human being rather than a category. Not the enemy, not Nazi, just a young man in an impossible situation. That night, back in the barracks, Gärtner couldn't sleep. Hendricks's words kept circling. "You seem like decent men." In 2 years of Nazi education, no one had ever suggested that decency and defeat could coexist. November 1943, the library opened. A shock in itself, a camp library stocked with books in German and English, newspapers, magazines. Prisoners could check out materials freely. There was a reading room with chairs and tables. On Sundays, some men would spend all day there. Gärtner started reading everything he could find: American newspapers, Time magazine, National Geographic. At first he read to improve his English, but gradually the content began to register. Articles about war production, American factories producing a bomber every hour, a tank every 7 minutes. Articles about agriculture. Despite sending food abroad, American citizens faced no rationing of meat, eggs, or fresh produce. Articles about civilian life. How many American families now owned cars? How many homes had electricity and telephones? And more troubling, articles about Germany. Reports on concentration camps, confirmed by neutral observers. Photographs of mass graves. Testimony from escaped prisoners describing systematic extermination. The American press published these accounts alongside images that made Gärtner's stomach turn. Many prisoners dismissed it as propaganda. Jewish lies, some said, fabricated to justify their war. But Gärtner kept reading, and as the months passed, as more evidence accumulated, as even German POWs who'd served in Poland admitted they'd seen things, the denials became harder to maintain. One morning he found Werner Krauss in the library staring at a photograph in Life magazine, a pile of skeletal corpses at a camp called Majdanek, recently liberated by Soviet forces. Krauss's face was gray. "We did this?" Gärtner didn't answer, couldn't. "We laughed at them," Krauss whispered. "The Americans. We called them weak. We said they were degenerate, and they're the ones feeding us, while we—" His voice broke. "While we did this." The photograph stayed with Gärtner. At night, trying to sleep, he'd see those skeletal faces. During the day, working at the Hendricks Ranch, eating Mrs. Hendricks' homemade pie, he'd think about the contrast. The Americans had every reason to brutalize their prisoners. Germany had brutalized theirs. But instead, America fed them, housed them, gave them medical care and libraries and work for wages. Why? The answer was becoming clear, and it was devastating, because America didn't need to prove its strength through cruelty. The country was so vast, so wealthy, so fundamentally powerful that it could afford to be humane. Germany's claims of superiority had been the desperate posturing of a nation that knew, deep down, it was outmatched. March 1945. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. The Red Army was in Berlin. American forces had crossed the Rhine. The Third Reich was collapsing in real time, documented in newsreels shown in the Camp Rec Hall every week. Gärtner watched footage of German cities reduced to rubble. Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne. The homes in those films looked like the neighborhood where he'd grown up. His hometown, Schweidnitz, was in Silesia, Soviet territory now. His parents had written twice since 1944, both letters heavily censored. The last one, received in January, mentioned difficult times and shortages. The euphemisms were transparent. At the Hendricks Ranch, work continued. But the mood had changed. The prisoners knew repatriation was coming. Some were eager, men from the western zones, where American and British forces were in control. Others were terrified, men from areas now under Soviet occupation. Gärtner fell into the latter category. One afternoon, Mrs. Hendricks called him into the kitchen. She'd never done that before. The kitchen was her domain, a bright space with yellow curtains and the perpetual smell of baking bread. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the table. He sat, confused. She poured him coffee, real coffee, the good stuff. She served her husband. Then she sat across from him and folded her hands. "Thomas told me about your family, where they are." Gärtner nodded slowly. "And you're going back there? To the Soviet zone?" "I am ordered to, when repatriation comes." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, what if you didn't go?" The question hit him like voltage. It is not possible. I am prisoner. There are procedures." "People disappear all the time," she said quietly, "especially during chaos. End of wars. Everyone moving around. A man could slip away, if he wanted to." Gärtner's heart was hammering. "Mrs. Hendricks, what you are suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything." Her eyes were very direct. "I'm just saying, you're a good worker, decent young man. You've got skills. And this country has room for men like you if they're willing to work hard and be honest." She stood up, ending the conversation, but before leaving the kitchen, she paused. "You've got time to think about it. Repatriation won't happen overnight. But if a man decided he'd rather stay, well, there are ways. People who'd help." After she left, Gärtner sat alone with his coffee, his hands shaking. The thought had been building for months. If you're finding this story as powerful as I did while researching it, if Georg's impossible choice is making you rethink everything you thought you knew about loyalty, about home, about what it means to choose your own destiny, do me a favor, hit that subscribe and like button. These forgotten stories, these human moments buried in history books, they need to be told. And your subscription helps me spend months digging through archives, POW camp records, and declassified FBI files to bring you more stories like this one. And if you've made it this far, through the cafeteria tray, through the Hendricks Ranch, through this kitchen conversation that's about to change Georg's entire future, leave a like. It tells YouTube that real history told honestly still matters. Now back to that shaking coffee cup, because what happens next will define the next 40 years of his life. Every time he ate American food, worked with American machinery, saw how American families lived. After she left, Gärtner sat alone with his coffee, his hands shaking. The thought had been building for months. Every time he ate American food, worked with American machinery, saw how American families lived. Every time he compared his memories of Germany, the shortages, the constant propaganda, the fear that permeated everything, with the abundance and freedom he'd witnessed here. He didn't love America, not yet. Love required deeper roots. But he loved what America represented, the possibility of a life built on work rather than ideology. A place where prosperity wasn't reserved for the party elite, where technological advancement wasn't just for military application, where you could speak your mind without checking who was listening. And the alternative? Return to Soviet-occupied Silesia? To a Germany divided and devastated, where the winners of the war would reshape society in their image? Where being a former Wehrmacht soldier might make you suspect, dangerous, unemployable? The choice wasn't between Germany and America. It was between the past and the future. September 23rd, 1945. The repatriation orders came. Camp Lordsburg would be emptied by October. All prisoners would be shipped to East Coast ports and transferred to vessels bound for Europe. Gärtner had 3 weeks. He spent them meticulously planning, studying maps in the library, memorizing American geography, learning idioms and slang to improve his English, saving extra food from the mess hall, accumulating small items that might be useful, a pocket knife, a compass, extra clothing. On the night of September 20th, during a work detail at a farm 15 miles from camp, Gärtner made his move. The guards were complacent. Why wouldn't they be? The war was over. These prisoners were cooperative. In 2 years, there had been only minor escape attempts, all quickly resolved. At 8:47 p.m., during the confusion of loading equipment back onto trucks, Gärtner simply walked away, into the darkness, across a field. into a grove of cottonwood trees. He walked all night. 23 miles by his estimation. As dawn broke over the New Mexico desert, he buried his POW uniform under a rock pile and changed into civilian clothes he'd gradually accumulated: denim work pants, a plain shirt, a jacket, common laborer's clothing that would let him blend in. In his pocket, $43 he'd saved from work wages, a forged Social Security card he'd purchased from another prisoner who'd somehow obtained blank forms, and a new name he'd chosen carefully, testing it silently for weeks until it felt natural: Dennis F. Wiles. Georg Gärtner, prisoner of war, ceased to exist. Dennis Wiles, American laborer, was born. 1945-1950, the learning years. The first year was terror. Wiles, he forced himself to think in that name, to respond to it automatically, moved constantly. New Mexico to Colorado to Utah. He worked construction jobs, ranch work, anything that paid cash, and asked few questions. Post-war America was flooded with transient workers, veterans returning home, displaced persons starting over. One more young man looking for work, barely registered, but every police car made his pulse spike. Every stranger who looked at him too long became a potential threat. Every news report about POW escapees made him change locations. The FBI was hunting him. He knew that. All POW escapees were federal fugitives, but America was vast, and the FBI had limited resources. If he stayed quiet, kept moving, avoided attention, he might just vanish into the country's endless spaces. Slowly, carefully, he built a life. He perfected his English. Not just the grammar and vocabulary, but the accent, the rhythm, the casual profanity that marked native speakers. He watched American movies obsessively, mimicking the actors' speech patterns. He read newspapers to learn cultural references. He studied baseball scores so he could make small talk. He became American through sheer force of will. 1953, Boulder, Colorado. He was working as a ski instructor now. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd learned to ski in the Wehrmacht mountain troops, and now those skills were making him money at a resort where wealthy Americans paid for lessons. The work was perfect for him. Physical, seasonal, requiring competence, but not extensive documentation. He was good at it, patience with beginners, skilled enough to impress intermediate skiers. And the mountain, the vast white silence of Colorado slopes, gave him peace. One morning, teaching a beginner class, he met Barbara Hansen. She was 26, a secretary from Denver, taking a weekend ski trip with friends. Pretty in an understated way, practical, funny. After the lesson, she asked if he'd join her for coffee. He almost said no. Relationships were dangerous. They meant questions about your past, meeting families, creating paper trails. But something in her directness, her easy smile, made him take the risk. "Sure," he said. "Coffee sounds nice." They dated for 11 months before he proposed. In that time, he told her a carefully constructed story. Dennis Wiles, orphaned young, raised by an uncle in rural Pennsylvania, served briefly in the Pacific Theater, came west after the war to start fresh. It was vague enough to discourage detailed questions, but plausible enough to satisfy casual curiosity. She never doubted him. They married in May 1954. Small ceremony. No family. He said his uncle had passed away. Hers lived in Minnesota and couldn't make the trip. Just friends and a justice of the peace. On their wedding night, lying beside his new wife in a Denver hotel room, Wiles felt the full weight of his deception. This woman loved a fiction, had married a ghost. If she ever learned the truth, but she wouldn't. He'd make sure of it. 1960s. The FBI Titans J. Edgar Hoover took POW escapees personally. To Hoover, they were an insult to American authority. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the FBI periodically renewed efforts to locate remaining fugitives. By 1960, most had been caught. Some had turned themselves in. Of the approximately 2,000 German POWs who'd escaped custody in America during the war years, fewer than a dozen remained at large. Lee's was one of them. In 1963, the FBI came close. An informant in California reported a German-speaking construction worker who seemed nervous around authority. Agents investigated, followed leads, knocked on doors. Wiles, working at a ski resort 300 miles away, heard about it through the worker grapevine. That night, he packed everything he owned into a car and drove to Oregon. Left no forwarding address. Told Barbara they needed to move for a better job opportunity. She trusted him, always trusted him. The guilt was becoming unbearable. 1970s, the weight of secrets. They had built a good life, a house in Lakewood, Colorado. Barbara had a career now, working for a local architectural firm. Wiles was managing a small construction company. They had friends, community ties, a mortgage. Every piece of normalcy was another chain binding him to the lie. In 1975, their 30th anniversary approaching, Barbara noticed he'd been distant, distracted. She asked if something was wrong. "Just tired," he said. "Work stress." But the real stress was time. He was 60 now. How much longer could he sustain this? The FBI might eventually stop looking, but his conscience wouldn't. Every time Barbara spoke about their history, their first meeting, their wedding, she was reinforcing a fiction. Their entire marriage was built on a foundation of deception. One night after too much whiskey, he almost told her. Sat at the kitchen table, Barbara reading beside him, and nearly said, "My real name is Georg Gärtner. I'm a fugitive. I've been lying to you for 21 years. But the words wouldn't come. If he told her, she'd have to choose. Turn him in, or become complicit in harboring a fugitive. Either choice would destroy her. The kindest thing he could do was continue the lie. So he did. September 1985, 65 years old, 40 years on the run, Wiles sat in his living room and read a newspaper article about the 40th anniversary of VE Day. The piece mentioned that federal authorities had closed investigations on remaining POW escapees. Statute of limitations had expired on most charges. The war was ancient history. One line stood out. The FBI believes fewer than 5 German POW fugitives remain unaccounted for. He was one of them, perhaps the last. That night, after Barbara fell asleep, Wiles went to the basement and retrieved a box he'd hidden 40 years ago. Inside, his original Wehrmacht identification papers. A photo of him in uniform, letters from his parents written in German, physical proof of Georg Gärtner's existence. He'd kept them as both evidence and insurance. If he was ever caught, he'd need proof of who he really was. But they were also a tether to his original identity, a reminder that Dennis Wiles was a performance, not a person. In the morning, he called the FBI field office in San Diego. "My name is Georg Gärtner," he said in careful English. "I was a prisoner of war who escaped in 1945. I'm calling to surrender." The agent thought it was a prank. "Sir, we don't have time for POW camp in Lordsburg, New Mexico. Escaped September 21st, 1945. Prisoner number 31A 44164, 190th Panzer Grenadier Regiment. Check your files." Silence. Then, "Hold, please." They sent agents to his house. Barbara was at work. Wiles met them at the door, handed them his original papers, and calmly explained his 40-year fugitive life. The agents were stunned. "Why now?" one asked. "Why turn yourself in after all this time?" Wiles looked around his living room. American furniture, American photographs, an entire American life. "Because I'm tired of running," he said, "and because I want to die as who I really am." The reckoning. The story exploded across national media. Last German POW surrenders after 40 years. Network news covered it. Newspapers ran features. The sheer audacity of his decades-long deception fascinated the public. Barbara learned the truth from television. She was at home, watching the evening news, when her husband's face appeared on screen. The reporter called him Georg Gärtner, showed photos of him in Wehrmacht uniform, detailed his escape and life under a false identity. She sat frozen, unable to process it. When Wiles, Gärtner came home that evening, escorted by agents who'd agreed to let him explain first. She was sitting at the kitchen table, silent, her face unreadable. "Barbara," he began, "who are you?" Her voice was very quiet, very controlled. "I'm the man you married. That hasn't changed." "You lied to me for 31 years. "Yes." "Our entire marriage was built on a lie." "No." He sat across from her, the same table where Mrs. Hendricks had once suggested he run. "The marriage was real. My feelings for you were real. Everything we built together was real. Only my name was false." "Only your name?" Her laugh was bitter. "Your name, your history, your family, where you came from, who you were. Everything that makes a person knowable." He had no defense. She was right. "Why didn't you tell me?" The anger was breaking into something worse, hurt, betrayal. "After we were married, after years together, why couldn't you trust me with the truth?" "Because telling you would have forced you to become a criminal too, harboring a fugitive. I couldn't do that to you." "So instead you made me live a lie without even knowing it?" They sat in silence. Outside, the Colorado evening was beautiful. Mountains purple against a darkening sky. The same landscape he'd fallen in love with 40 years ago, when America had shown him a different possibility. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I'm so sorry, Barbara." She didn't respond, just sat with her hands folded, staring at nothing. Aftermath. The federal government struggled with what to do with him. Technically, Gärtner had violated multiple laws, escaping custody, using false identification, evading federal authorities for 4 decades. But the prosecutors faced unusual circumstances. The Geneva Convention violations were moot. There was no war to return him to. He'd committed no crimes during his fugitive years beyond the identity fraud. He'd been a model citizen under his false name. And crucially, there was public sympathy. News interviews revealed his story. A young soldier disillusioned by Nazi propaganda, impressed by American humanity, who'd chosen to stay and build a productive life. Veterans groups noted he'd worked hard, paid taxes, contributed to communities. Some called him a symbol of American redemption, proof that even enemies could be transformed by exposure to American values. In the end, the Justice Department issued a fine, $1,000 for the forged Social Security card, and let him go. No prison time, no deportation. After 40 years as a fugitive, Georg Gärtner was finally free. But freedom came at a cost. Barbara filed for divorce 6 months later. She couldn't reconcile the deception, couldn't trust that anything in their marriage had been real. The betrayal was too fundamental. He didn't contest it. Final years. Gärtner lived another 12 years as himself, gave interviews, wrote a memoir, spoke at schools and veterans groups about his experience. He became something of a curiosity, the last German POW, the man who'd loved America enough to become a fugitive for it. Reporters always asked the same question. Do you regret it? Escaping? Living under a false identity? All those years on the run? His answer was always honest. I regret the pain I caused, especially to Barbara, but I don't regret the choice to stay. America saved my life, not just physically, but spiritually. The country I was raised to hate showed me more humanity than my own nation ever did. How could I not want to be part of that? He died in 2013, aged 97, in a nursing home in San Diego. At his funeral, attended by a handful of friends and his children from Barbara's second marriage, who'd eventually reconciled with him, the pastor noted that Gärtner had lived 2 lives, one defined by propaganda and war, the other by choice and freedom. He crossed an ocean twice, the pastor said, once in chains, returning as a prisoner. The second time in spirit, choosing to become American not by birth but by belief. That journey from enemy to citizen, from Georg to Dennis and back to Georg, is as American a story as any I know. In his final interview, recorded 6 months before his death, Gärtner was asked to identify the moment when he decided to stay. He was quiet for a long time. Then, it wasn't one moment. It was accumulation, but if I had to choose, it was the first meal. September 1943, Camp Lordsburg. That cafeteria tray. The interviewer looked confused. The tray? I'd been taught America was weak, degenerate, starving, and then they handed me a tray with more food than I'd seen in months. Good food, generous portions. For prisoners, for enemies. He smiled, but his eyes were distant, seeing that New Mexico mess hall across 7 decades. That tray told me everything the propaganda had been wrong. If America could feed its enemies this well, what did that say about German claims of superiority? If the weak Americans had such abundance that they could afford generosity even in war, what did that make us? His hands, spotted with age, gestured at memory. Every authoritarian system survives by convincing its people that everyone else is worse, that suffering is necessary because the alternatives are more terrible. But when you actually see the alternative, when you touch it, taste it, live in it, the lies can't survive. That tray of food cracked open my worldview. Everything that followed, the work on American farms, the libraries, the way ordinary people treated us, just widened those cracks until the whole structure collapsed. And I had to choose, return to the lie or stay with the truth. I chose truth, even though it cost me 40 years of freedom, even though it destroyed my marriage, even though it meant living as a ghost. He leaned forward, suddenly intense despite his age. But here's what people don't understand. I was never really free in Germany. I was free the moment I saw that tray, because I could finally see the cage I'd been living in. The interviewer asked one final question. If you could do it again, knowing everything it would cost, would you still run? Georg Gärtner, formerly Dennis Wiles, formerly prisoner 31A 44164, formerly sergeant in the 190th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, formerly a believer in German superiority and Nazi promises, smiled. In a heartbeat, he said, in a heartbeat. Georg Gärtner's story took me 4 months to research. 4 months in archives, reading declassified FBI files, cross-referencing POW camp records, tracking down obscure memoirs. 4 months to find that cafeteria tray moment, to verify those penicillin supplies, to reconstruct Mrs. Hendricks's kitchen conversation from fragments of testimony. I could have made 10 quick viral videos in that time, hit trending topics, chased the algorithm, made the same surface-level content everyone else makes. But I didn't, because stories like Georg's, stories about cafeteria trays that shattered propaganda, about impossible choices between 2 countries, about 40 years lived as a ghost, these stories deserve months, not minutes. If this kind of deep storytelling is what you want to see more of, if you want me to keep spending months buried in archives instead of days chasing trends, you can leave a super thanks. It's the heart button below this video, any amount you choose. And here's what it does. It tells me that this work matters. That someone out there values the months of research. That I should keep digging into forgotten history instead of pivoting to whatever's viral this week. Every super thanks is a vote. A vote that says, yes, spend 4 months on the next story. Find the next Georg Gärtner. Bring us more truths that were buried in dusty files. It keeps me motivated to do this work, to find these stories, to tell them right. Because honestly, there are easier ways to make content. But there aren't many better stories than the one about a Nazi soldier who loved his American prison so much, he became a fugitive for 40 years just to stay. Thanks for watching. And if this story moved you, you know where that heart button is.